By the summer of 1943, the oil fields of Ploesti, Romania, had become one of the most heavily defended industrial targets in Europe. They were not simply another strategic objective. They were the lifeblood of the German war machine. More than a third of Germany's refined petroleum products flowed from the refineries clustered around the city, feeding the Luftwaffe, the panzer divisions, and the mechanized logistics that sustained operations across the Eastern Front. Allied planners understood that crippling Ploesti could shorten the war. German commanders understood that losing it could make continued large-scale operations impossible. As a result, Ploesti was encircled by a dense, layered air defense network that combined radar, heavy and light flak, and fighter interception units trained specifically to counter low and medium-altitude bomber attacks. On that and August 1943, the United States Army Air Forces launched Operation Tidal Wave, a massive low-level bombing raid intended to bypass radar detection and strike the refineries directly. More than 177 B-24 Liberators took off from airfields in Libya, flying an unprecedented round-trip distance of over 400 miles. The operation was one of the most ambitious and risky bombing missions of the war. The B-24 was chosen for its long range and heavy bomb load, but it was not designed to absorb punishment at low altitude over heavily defended territory. At low level, its large wingspan and relatively light armor made it vulnerable to concentrated anti-aircraft fire and fighter attack. By the time the bombers reached Romanian airspace, the mission was already unraveling. Navigation errors split formations. Some groups approached Ploesti from the wrong direction, alerting German defenses earlier than planned. Smoke from burning refineries obscured targets and flight paths. Anti-aircraft batteries pre-sighted and rehearsed opened fire with devastating accuracy. Of the 177 aircraft that departed, 53 were lost, and hundreds of aircrew were killed or captured. It was one of the costliest single-day missions in U.S. Army Air Force's history. Within that chaos, one aircraft stood out not because it completed its mission flawlessly, but because it survived under conditions that should have made survival statistically impossible. This B-24, part of the 98th Bombardment Group, became separated from its formation during the withdrawal phase after releasing its bombs. Alone, damaged, and flying at reduced speed, it presented an ideal target for German fighter units scrambled from airfields across southern Romania. By all available metrics, it should not have returned. German records indicate that at least 47 fighter aircraft were vectored toward the lone Liberator during its withdrawal from the target area. These fighters included Messerschmitt Bf 9s and Foch, Luftwaffe 90s aircraft specifically optimized for bomber interception. They were faster, more maneuverable, and armed with cannons capable of shredding a 4-engine bomber in seconds. Under normal circumstances, a single B-24 confronted by even a fraction of that number would have been destroyed quickly. Yet over the course of nearly an hour, repeated interception attempts failed to bring it down. The Liberator's ordeal began almost immediately after it cleared the target area. Low-level egress routes were chaotic, filled with smoke columns, burning aircraft, and disorganized formations. The bomber's pilot, aware that remaining at low altitude made them vulnerable to both ground fire and fighters, gradually climbed once clear of the densest flak. This climb, however, was slow. The aircraft had sustained damage to its control surfaces and one engine was running below optimal power. Its speed was reduced, making it an obvious straggler. German radar stations, which had tracked the inbound raid despite Allied attempts to mask their approach, now shifted focus to intercepting withdrawing bombers. Fighter control officers identified isolated targets and directed interceptors accordingly. The lone B-24 was quickly designated a priority. Unlike tightly packed bomber formations that could saturate defensive fire with overlapping gun coverage, a single aircraft offered no mutual support. The Germans expected an easy kill. The first intercept occurred roughly 20 minutes after the Liberator left the immediate Ploesti area. A flight of Bf 109s approached from the rear quarter, climbing slightly to gain positional advantage. The German pilots employed standard interception tactics, closing from below and behind to avoid the bomber's forward-firing guns. The Liberator's crew, however, had already repositioned gunners and redistributed ammunition, anticipating exactly this scenario. The tail gunner opened fire early, forcing the fighters to break off their initial pass. One Bf-109 was damaged but not destroyed. The Germans disengaged briefly to reorganize. This pattern repeated itself throughout the engagement. German fighters attacked in small groups rather than massed waves, a decision shaped by fuel constraints, command and control limitations, and the desire to minimize losses. Each pass inflicted incremental damage on the Liberator, but none proved decisive. The bomber's structure absorbed hits that would have crippled lighter aircraft. Its self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic fires. Redundancy in its control systems allowed it to remain flyable even as cables were severed and hydraulics degraded. Crucially, the B-24's crew maintained discipline. There was no panic, no wasteful firing. Gunners coordinated their arcs, ensuring that attacking fighters were met with concentrated fire. The pilot avoided violent evasive maneuvers that could overstress the damaged airframe, instead relying on gentle course changes to disrupt firing solutions. This steadiness frustrated German pilots accustomed to bombers that either broke formation or attempted abrupt dives under attack. As the engagement continued, more German fighters joined the pursuit. Records from Luftwaffe units stationed at Otopeni, Pipera, and T-Rogi or airfields indicate that multiple squadrons were involved over the course of the interception. However, the Luftwaffe faced its own constraints. Fighter pilots were operating near the limits of their range. Time spent attacking one aircraft reduced fuel margins for return. Ammunition expended on non-lethal hits could not be replenished mid-air. Coordination between units, particularly once the bomber moved away from the immediate Ploesti defense zone, became increasingly difficult. Weather also played a role. Haze and scattered cloud layers reduced visibility intermittently, forcing German pilots to reacquire the target repeatedly. Each lost contact increased the Liberator's chances of escape. The bomber crew exploited these conditions, adjusting altitude to slip into cloud cover whenever possible. These maneuvers were subtle but effective, breaking visual locks without exposing the aircraft to uncontrolled descent. The Liberator's gunners claimed multiple hits during the engagement, though post-war analysis suggests that only a small number of German fighters were seriously damaged. Nevertheless, even near misses forced attacking pilots to disengage, reassess, and reapproach, consuming time and fuel. The cumulative effect was attritional, not in terms of losses but in momentum. The longer the bomber remained airborne, the less viable continued pursuit became. German doctrine emphasized efficiency and interception. Fighters were not expected to chase a single aircraft indefinitely, particularly when broader operational demands required readiness for additional Allied sorties. As the Liberator moved westward, beyond the densest concentration of defenses, command decisions shifted. Interceptors were recalled or reassigned. What began as a determined effort to destroy a straggler gradually lost priority. By the time the Liberator crossed into less heavily defended airspace, it had survived dozens of attack runs. Its exterior was riddled with holes. Several crew members were wounded. One engine was operating on borrowed time. Yet the aircraft remained airborne. The very characteristics that made the B-24 controversial among crews, its stiffness, its unforgiving flight characteristics, its reliance on discipline, had become assets in this context. It did not yield easily to damage. It did not collapse under stress. The failure of 47 German fighters to down a single B-24 was not the result of a single miraculous moment. It was the product of cumulative factors: aircraft design, crew training, tactical restraint, environmental conditions, and the limitations of even a well-organized air defense system when confronted with a determined, resilient target. Over Ploesti, the Luftwaffe had demonstrated formidable defensive capability, inflicting catastrophic losses on the attacking force. But against this one aircraft, the system did not close the loop fast enough. As the Liberator continued its long flight back toward Allied territory, its crew remained unaware of the full scale of the interception effort they had survived. They knew only that they were still alive, still airborne, and still far from safety. The Channel, the Mediterranean, and friendly airfields lay hours away. Survival over Ploesti did not guarantee survival overall. But the most improbable phase of their journey was already behind them. What happened next? How the aircraft held together over that distance, how the crew managed wounds, fatigue, and mechanical failure, and how post-mission analysis reshaped Allied understanding of bomber survivability would only become clear after landing. The Liberator's escape from Ploesti was not just a tactical anomaly. It was a case study in the limits of air power, on both sides, at one of the most heavily defended points in Europe. Once the Liberator had cleared the immediate defensive ring around Ploesti, the situation aboard the aircraft remained precarious. Survival was not yet secured, it had merely entered a different phase. The bomber was now flying hundreds of miles over hostile or semi-hostile territory with limited escort, degraded performance, and a crew operating under sustained stress. The damage sustained during the withdrawal was cumulative rather than catastrophic, but cumulative damage was often more dangerous. Systems failed not all at once, but incrementally, forcing constant adjustment and increasing the risk of a cascading breakdown. Inside the aircraft, the intercom crackled intermittently. Electrical damage had compromised communications between some crew positions, forcing gunners and flight engineers to rely on hand signals and shouted instructions through the fuselage. The flight engineer monitored engine temperatures obsessively, aware that the compromised power plant could fail without warning. The pilot maintained a conservative throttle setting, sacrificing speed for stability. Pushing the engines harder might have gained distance, but it also risked losing thrust entirely. At altitude, with a heavy aircraft and no escort, an engine failure could mean a slow, unrecoverable descent. Crew injuries further complicated the situation. Several men had been wounded during the fighter attacks, primarily by shrapnel and fragments from cannon shells that penetrated the fuselage. None were immediately fatal, but blood loss, pain, and shock degraded performance. The Liberator's design offered limited internal access between compartments, making it difficult to move wounded crew members or provide comprehensive aid. First aid was administered where possible, but the priority remained keeping the aircraft airborne. In heavy bombers, survival often required accepting that some injuries would remain untreated until landing. The German pursuit did not end abruptly. It tapered. Luftwaffe fighters continued to make sporadic contact for another 30 minutes as the bomber moved westward. These later attacks were less coordinated, often involving individual aircraft or pairs rather than organized flights. Fuel limitations played a decisive role. Fighters scrambled from Romanian airfields had limited endurance, especially after prolonged engagement. Chasing a damaged bomber deeper into enemy airspace risked forcing pilots to bail out or crash on return. Luftwaffe command doctrine emphasized preserving fighter assets for defense of critical zones rather than sacrificing them in extended pursuits. German after-action reports later reflected frustration rather than confusion. Pilots reported repeated hits on the bomber, but also noted its resilience and the effectiveness of its defensive fire. Several accounts mentioned the difficulty of achieving a stable firing position due to the bomber's steady but unpredictable course changes. Unlike bombers that attempted aggressive evasive maneuvers, this Liberator flew with disciplined consistency. That consistency denied attackers the predictable angles needed for sustained cannon fire. In effect, the crew's restraint reduced their vulnerability. As contact with German fighters diminished, a new threat emerged: mechanical endurance. The B-24's reputation among crews was mixed. It offered greater range and bomb load than the B-17, but it was less forgiving under stress. Its high aspect ratio wing provided efficiency but could fail catastrophically if overstressed. Structural damage sustained over Ploesti raised the risk of fatigue failure during prolonged flight. Every hour in the air increased that risk. The pilot avoided turbulence whenever possible, adjusting altitude to find smoother air even if it meant less optimal engine performance. Navigation posed another challenge. The mission's disruption had scattered formations and degraded navigational accuracy. Landmarks used during the inbound leg were obscured by smoke or approached from unfamiliar angles during withdrawal. The navigator worked continuously, cross-referencing dead reckoning estimates with visible terrain and remaining instruments. Errors of even a few degrees could result in drifting into more heavily defended areas or missing safe corridors altogether. Fuel calculations were revised repeatedly as engine efficiency declined. Despite these difficulties, the aircraft maintained course toward Allied, controlled territory. The Mediterranean lay ahead, but reaching it required crossing areas still under Axis influence. Flak concentrations were lighter than around Ploesti, but isolated batteries posed a threat to a damaged aircraft unable to maneuver aggressively. The crew remained alert, gunners scanning constantly despite fatigue. Ammunition levels were lower than optimal, but sufficient to deter isolated interceptors if necessary. By the time the Liberator reached the coastline, the crew's endurance was nearly exhausted. Hours of sustained vigilance had taken a toll. Yet crossing that boundary marked a psychological shift. While the aircraft was still at risk from mechanical failure or navigational error, the immediate threat of organized German interception had passed. The airspace beyond offered greater chances of rescue or emergency landing if required. The final leg of the flight was conducted with extreme caution. The pilot coordinated with Allied controllers using degraded radio equipment, providing intermittent position updates. Landing options were limited. Diverting to the nearest field reduced time airborne, but carried risks if runways were short or facilities inadequate to handle a damaged heavy bomber. The decision was made to continue to a primary base capable of supporting emergency repairs and medical treatment. When the Liberator finally touched down, the landing was controlled but tense. The aircraft's weakened systems demanded precise handling. Fire crews and medical personnel were standing by, aware from radio reports that a heavily damaged bomber was inbound. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, the full extent of the damage became visible. The fuselage was perforated by dozens of holes. Control surfaces showed signs of stress and partial failure. One engine was leaking oil heavily, its continued operation beyond that point uncertain. Post-mission inspection confirmed what the crew had sensed during the flight. The aircraft had been close to catastrophic failure. Several hits had narrowly missed critical structural elements. Had even one shell detonated slightly differently, the outcome would have been fatal. The survival of the aircraft was not the result of invulnerability, but of margins that had not yet been exceeded. From a German perspective, the failure to destroy the Liberator prompted analysis but little introspection. Luftwaffe defenses over Ploesti had inflicted severe losses overall. The destruction of dozens of bombers validated the defensive strategy in broad terms. The escape of a single aircraft, even one pursued by many fighters, did not undermine that assessment. German commanders attributed the failure primarily to fuel constraints and the necessity of reallocating fighters to other sectors. In the context of the wider battle, the outcome was acceptable. From an Allied perspective, however, the incident offered valuable insights. The engagement demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of heavy bomber survivability. It highlighted the importance of disciplined crew coordination, conservative flight handling, and robust aircraft design. It also underscored the risks inherent in low-level attacks against heavily defended targets. While Operation Tidal Wave inflicted significant damage on Ploesti's refineries, the cost was enormous and the results were temporary. Production resumed within weeks, forcing Allied planners to reconsider the balance between risk and reward. The story of the single B-24 that survived repeated interception did not become widely known during the war. It did not fit neatly into propaganda narratives, which focused either on overwhelming success or tragic sacrifice. Instead, it occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, a demonstration of resilience amid failure. For the crew, the experience was not a triumph but a reminder of how narrow the margin of survival could be. Many of their comrades had not returned. In later years, historians would examine engagements like this one to understand why air defense systems, even when effective, were not absolute. The interaction between bomber design, crew training, defensive armament, and interceptor doctrine created outcomes that defied simple calculation. 47 fighters confronting a single bomber should have produced a predictable result. That it did not illustrates the complexity of air combat, where probability governs outcomes but does not dictate them with certainty. Over Ploesti, the Luftwaffe demonstrated that it could impose devastating costs. Yet this one engagement revealed that even the most concentrated defenses had limits. Those limits were defined not by ideology or intent, but by physics, logistics, human endurance, and the imperfect nature of coordination under combat conditions. The Liberator's survival did not change the course of the war, but it provided a stark example of how individual aircraft and crews could sometimes slip through systems designed to be impenetrable. For the men aboard that B-24, the question of why 47 fighters failed to down them was never abstract. It was answered in fragments: a gunner firing at the right moment, a pilot refusing to overcorrect, an engineer nursing a failing engine, a navigator holding a steady course. Survival emerged not from a single act, but from a chain of decisions made under pressure, each one preserving just enough margin to allow the next. When the crew disembarked, there were no celebrations. There was exhaustion, medical evacuation, and the quiet processing of what had occurred. In the broader accounting of Operation Tidal Wave, their aircraft was listed among those that returned. In the statistics, it was one line among many. But in examining the limits of air power over Ploesti, that line carries weight. It represents a point where expectation and reality diverged, and where the assumptions of both attacker and defender were tested to their breaking point. That divergence is the core of the story, not why the Liberator survived in a romantic sense, but why the system designed to destroy it did not close fast enough. In that gap between intent and outcome lies the answer to the question posed over the skies of Romania in 1943.